As the definitive automotive scandal, the DeLorean DMC-12, conceived as one of many attempts to provide a sustainable sports car that would break the planned obsolescence of the Detroit Big Three, started with ambitions that were promising to many of those involved in its conception, providing the marketplace with a truly beautiful machine, while also presenting major employment benefits to the economically deprived and war-torn suburbs of Belfast in Northern Ireland. Sadly, the dream would unravel quickly, and at the end of the tale would be a company in tatters, dreams of sustained employment dashed, the company founder arrested, millions of pounds of taxpayer money unaccounted for, legal wrangling that would last for decades, and one of the greatest pop culture icons of the 20th century. In April 1973, an aspiring automaker would rise to challenge the Detroit Big Three, that being seasoned car designer and veteran of General Motors, John Zachary DeLorean, who had unexpectedly resigned from the role of vice president of car and truck production, despite being tipped for president of General Motors itself. DeLorean, though, was a maverick figure of General Motors' automotive design departments, having delivered the famous Pontiac GTO, one of the seminal models of the 1960s. Though feeling constrained by the corporate limitations of a car builder firmly set in its ways, the designer opted to set up his own company and build an exotic sports car completely unheard of for a mainstream American motor firm. From the very beginning, he knew exactly what he wanted, and hired GM engineering savant Bill Collins to implement his scheme of delivering an American equivalent to the new BMW CS Coupe, impressing aspirational buyers by being very European in feel, while the car's assembly would incorporate such forward-thinking facets as stainless steel bodywork to reduce the common issue of rust, and gull-wing doors, adorning his car with the same exciting image as the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL. Throughout 1973 and into 1974, DeLorean would finance his new car through a deal worth $500,000 with the Allstate Insurance Company, presenting his proposed sports coupe as the DeLorean Safety Vehicle, or DSV-1, with the insurance company funding the creation of a prototype that would be taken forward into production should the demand be present, though before the deal could be finalized, Allstate lost interest, leaving DeLorean to finance the prototype with his own money. By the end of 1974, he and Collins had approached Ital Design's Giorgetto Giugiaro in order to conceive the car's looks, and after brief negotiations, the renowned Italian began working on the prototype styling, with the exacting demands of DeLorean's parameters. The basic fundamentals of the new car being, aside from the need to incorporate gull-wing doors and a stainless steel body, that it would feature flush-fitting bumpers, be mid-engined, and would be commodious enough for tall drivers. For power, DeLorean had initially considered the use of an innovative Wankel rotary engine, but following discussions with the main users of the Wankel power plant, Citroën and Mazda, neither were willing to supply these engines in the volume envisaged, thus leading to other contenders such as the Ford Cologne V6 and the 2-litre Citroën CX engine. Eventually, towards the end of the development program, DeLorean's engineers were able to source the V6 Duvron PRV engine from the Renault 30, though this choice, based on the fact that Giugiaro had packaged his mid-engine design around Citroën's inline-4 power unit, caused a fundamental engineering shift, with the V6 power pack needing to be repositioned behind the rear axle line to maintain interior room. For the body construction, this would employ a highly advanced composite system dubbed elastic reservoir molding that allowed the steel outer panels to be bonded to a two-piece understructure, a groundbreaking assembly method that added desirability. However, DeLorean was soon faced with the need to provide a suitable production facility, the most serious offer on the table being from the Puerto Rican government, who were willing to provide a $60 million grant package, as supported by the American government, and an excellent location within an abandoned military base, though delays in the project pushed him into talks with the Northern Ireland Development Agency. In a bold move, and one potentially fraught with danger, DeLorean struck a deal with the Labour government of British Prime Minister James Callaghan to establish the DeLorean factory on a greenfield site in Dunmurry near Belfast, as engendered through the provision of $117 million of UK taxpayers' money, with the contracts being signed in July 1978. Alongside the Dunmurry factory, a management and logistics centre was opened in Coventry, where staff were rapidly hired to start setting up the new supply deals in the UK, while DeLorean and Lotus founder Colin Chapman signed an agreement for the latter to develop DeLorean's first model, the DMC-12, to production readiness. Formerly established as DeLorean Motorcars Limited in October 1978, John DeLorean was essentially starting from scratch when it came to creating his car company, intending to deliver an underdeveloped model at 3 locations, including Dunmurry, Hethel and Coventry, while at the same time having to strike up deals with a myriad of component suppliers in the West Midlands. Furthermore, the situation of the plant in Dunmurry, amid the background of severe religious violence caused by the IRA's ongoing campaign against the British occupation of Northern Ireland, was one that created its own problems beyond the safety of the plant itself, but also the workforce. Located near the Catholic Twinbrook estate, the factory was perfectly placed to deal with the area's rampant unemployment, which sat as high as 50% in the Catholic areas, with the plant's locale being equidistant between large Catholic and Protestant housing estates, though more pressing was the lack of skill among the local workforce, who would require considerable training, and a lack of automotive industry infrastructure in place for a quick startup. As for the prototype's development, this was essentially outsourced entirely to Lotus, with Collins being tasked to deliver the car in cooperation with Chapman, with the Lotus Esprit, one of the finest mid-engined sports cars on sale at the time, being used as the benchmark for the performance of the DMC-12. However, Collins soon found that Chapman had simply taken a Lotus Esprit and re-engineered it with the proposed stainless steel body and gull-wing doors, cutting down many of the ambitious design principles envisaged by the original concept, though in truth, DeLorean's strict timescales gave Lotus little choice but to cut corners wherever possible. Thus, instead of utilizing DeLorean's highly advanced underbody, Lotus would adopt a chassis structure near identical to that of the Esprit, with a backbone chassis being employed, and the vacuum-assisted resin injection or VARI method of body assembly being introduced to replace the complex and costly ERM system that Collins had proposed back in 1975. Nevertheless, while the body assembly was much more conventional than what had originally been considered, stainless steel outer panels would still adorn the car, and thus give customers the misleading impression that the machine was more advanced than it actually was, with Lotus receiving royalties for its patented system for every DMC-12 built. Beyond the body and chassis assembly, the similarities between the DeLorean and the Esprit went deeper, with the all-independent suspension with front double wishbones and a rear multi-link being almost identical, leading to exceptional handling and a superb ride quality thanks to its relatively high ride setup and large super sticky tyres, while the rack and pinion steering was also set up to Lotus specification. Performance, though, was something the Esprit and DMC-12 had little in common with, as once emissions equipment demanded by the American government had been applied to the already underpowered Renault 30 engine, the 2.8-litre V6 would only be able to produce a mere 130 horsepower. By December 1979, and just over a year after setting up production in Northern Ireland, Lotus began turning over the finalised project to DeLorean so as to start production, and although development wasn't finished, with fine-tuning still needed prior to sales entry, mass assembly was given the go-ahead at the Dunmurry plant. DeLorean, however, had set an impossible schedule to meet, promising the British government that the pilot build cars would be rolling off the line by May 1980, and within the following year, the factory would be producing 30,000 cars per annum. Despite the enormity of the task, though, DeLorean would not stand at the head of his company in the location of its main production facility, instead remaining at the firm's New York office, while relying on industry heavyweights such as purchasing director Barry Wills and Chuck Bennington of General Motors to oversee the operation running in the UK. On January 21, 1981, 8 months late and £34 million over budget, the first DMC-12 rolled off the line at Dunmurry, the resultant car released to the public remaining severely underpowered and lacking in build quality, though despite efforts to improve these initial faults, road tests were generally kind to DeLorean's sports car, with its road manners being compared favourably to that of the Porsche 911 and the Ferrari 308. However, upon its launch in 1981, it was clear from the outset that the efficient and economical sports car originally conceived by DeLorean back in April 1973 was not the car people were treated to when examples appeared in American showrooms, illustrating continued quality faults with the electronics that would fail constantly, a lack of power from the detuned Renault engine, and its supposedly stainless steel finish that would be marred by fingerprints. Furthermore, the cost of the DMC-12, in consideration of its stripped-down but still extremely complicated production, was $25,600, or $86,800 in 2024, which was not only near double the cost of its intended main competitor, the $16,258 Chevrolet Corvette, but pushed the machine into the bracket of far more capable and refined sports cars, such as the Porsche 911 and the Ferrari 308, for which it had no chance of competing on even terms. In response to its lack of performance, DeLorean considered potentially turbocharging the DMC-12, but due to the company's lack of resources, this task was outsourced to the New York-based Legend Industries, which had previously worked to install turbochargers into forced induction Fiat Spiders, DeLorean's proviso being that the DMC-12 Turbo wouldn't be a peaky performer like the Porsche 911, but instead a smooth accelerating cruiser. 4 turbos were eventually built, a pair of single turbo cars and 2 twin turbos, these being tested at the Bridgehampton Raceway in 1981, during which the twin-turbo DeLorean posted a 0-60 time of 5.8 seconds, while covering the quarter-mile course in a very respectable 14.7 seconds, placing it on par with the Lotus Esprit Turbo, which had often been described as Britain's Ferrari due to its Junior League supercar performance. Thus, DeLorean ordered 5,000 turbo conversions from Legend Industries, and planned to offer these models as $7,500 options for the 1984 model year. Though despite all the promise of the turbo editions, truly giving the car the performance it deserved, it would unfortunately never come to fruition. Sadly, despite promising early sales, the queue of willing buyers for the DMC-12 had dried up by the end of the year as the ongoing recession caused by the 1979 oil crisis continued to suppress the wider American automotive sector, with stockpiles of unsold cars starting to mount up both in Dunmurray and on the docksides of harbours in the United States, exacerbated by the UK winter of 1982, the worst winter in 50 years, which created a logistical nightmare. For DMC, as the company had been built on fragile finances, and with no other monetary backing beyond the taxpayer investments of the British government, DeLorean desperately sought additional funding from any sources available to him in the United States, as well as managing to top up his investment from the unwilling Conservative government of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was a vocal opponent of supporting UK-based car makers such as British Leyland. In January 1982, production was slashed, and the factory moved to a 3-day week, with plans being accelerated to give the DMC-12 Euro-type approval, a task that DeLorean had originally considered unnecessary, while an emergency program headed by Barry Wills in Coventry was instigated, but this came far too late, and the money finally ran out. On February 19, 1982, the official receivers were called in, and, after forming DMC Limited as a successor to the failed DeLorean Motorcars Limited, funded the continued development of UK-spec DMC-12s, while a viable rescue plan was devised, the deadline for this being July 31st of the same year, during which DeLorean himself would have to drum up the necessary financial assistance, expecting that the British government would foot the bill to avoid heavy job losses. Meanwhile, DeLorean's head of marketing, Tom Ronayne, toured Europe hosting a market roadshow to sound out potential sales outlets, with the positive feedback garnered being enough to organise a rescue bid, the immediate issue being to increase demand and production at Dunmurray and to start moving stockpiled cars in the United States. During the previous year, amid the end of car production by British Leyland at the Solihull factory in Birmingham, alongside the discontinuation of the Triumph TR7 and TR8 sports cars, Barry Wills and Chuck Bennington approached British Leyland with the proposal of purchasing the tooling and rights for the TR7 and TR8, thus creating a DMC-badged version of the former British Leyland sports cars at the underutilised factory in Northern Ireland. On July 29th, Austin Rovers chairman Harold Musgrove and British Leyland's commercial director Mark Snowden informed the pair that they could have the rights and tooling for a commercially realistic price, as long as the car they produced didn't too closely resemble the TR7 or TR8, this plan having major potential to rescue DeLorean, with the smaller rebranded cars opening up the possibility of volume production to Dunmurray. Such was the faith that Wills and Bennington had in the scheme, that they were able to receive a commitment to funding from a consortium of financial backers, subject to the agreement of the official receivers. However, on October 19, 1982, a 4-month operation by the FBI came to its climax when DeLorean was cornered in a Los Angeles hotel room, attempting to broker $24 million worth of cocaine deals as a means of generating short-term capital for the DMC company, destroying what little goodwill was left with the car maker and subsequently sealing the fate of the DMC brand. For Wills and Bennington, they too had run out of time and money, the British government refusing to invest any more capital into the tarnished operation, and the receivers were thus forced to close down the company, the outcome of which was a production run of less than 2 years and only 9,080 cars. For John DeLorean, he would escape serving jail time when his defense lawyers successfully argued that the FBI and DEA had unfairly targeted and illegally entrapped him, and thus on August 16, 1984, he was found not guilty and allowed to go free, though by this point the DMC firm had long since gone bankrupt and his reputation was all but in tatters. This, however, was only the beginning of DeLorean's ongoing cycle of legal battles, as once the official administrator had been called in to wrap up the DeLorean firm, it was found that, of the cumulative $100 million of state funding injected by the British government, $18.3 million of this sum, or $59.4 million in 2024, had gone missing. Amid the fallout of the DeLorean company's collapse, Colin Chapman of Lotus had died at the age of 54 from a heart attack on December 16, 1982, prior to which the Lotus Group's 1981 accounts were overdue for audit, and only opened after he had passed away, revealing that Lotus had been paid for engineering work by DeLorean via a Switzerland-based Panamanian company run by a DeLorean distributor, despite Chapman's previous protestations that neither he nor the company had been paid via Panama. With the deceit unravelled, Lotus Group accountant Fred Bushell, who had funneled £5 million to himself in the fraud, was put on trial, though the judge noted that had Chapman lived to see his day in court, he would have received a sentence of at least 10 years. As for the Lotus-built DMC-12 engineering concept, this was later sold by the UK government-appointed administrators to Toyota, who used it to develop the AW11 MR2 of 1984, while the liquidators also recovered around £20 million from Swiss bank accounts controlled by Chapman and John DeLorean, the former DMC factory being sold on to French automotive supplier Montupet, and is still operated today as a subsidiary of the Linamar Corporation. In his later years, DeLorean would dabble in a possible advanced monorail system that never came to fruition, as well as potentially reviving his DeLorean Motor Company during the 1990s with a new vehicle called the DMC-2. But the weight of the original DeLorean car firm would continue to hang over him for nearly 20 years after its collapse, with the expense of the legal battles fought over the fallout of its demise, leading him to file for personal bankruptcy in 1999. John DeLorean would eventually pass away at the age of 80 from a stroke in Summit, New Jersey on March 19, 2005, while the DeLorean Motor Company name was subsequently purchased by a Texas-based firm that provides parts and professional restoration for DMC-12 owners. As for the DMC-12 itself, while the car's build quality and notorious dealings were already the stuff of legend, it was the car's appearance in the Back to the Future series that truly cemented its place as an automotive cornerstone, with many of the approximately 5,000 cars still known to exist being styled to look like the famous time machine that has now become an enduring pop culture icon. To summarize, the DeLorean DMC-12 had many promising ideas behind its conception, with a style and profile that was quintessentially 80s, while at the same time proposing technical facets and design choices that would truly make the car stand out against the likes of contemporary Porsches and Ferraris, presenting the American market with what was, for all intents and purposes, a budget European sports car. In the end, DeLorean's ambitions, like with so many independent car projects, outweighed the practical limits of the technology he was working with, and once the vicious cycle of attempting to remediate the problems with the cars following their entry into the market had begun, there was little to no chance he could save his firm without resorting to desperate measures. Nevertheless, the DMC-12 would truly be the winner in the end, as even though the car on a driving level is somewhat mundane for all its aesthetic appeal, its appearance in the Back to the Future films turned what may have been just an obscurity of the early 1980s into an immortal road-going legend, and a car that today is immediately recognizable either dressed up as the iconic time machine or in its original form as it came down the Dunmurray production line.